Great. Welcome, everyone. I see a lot of old faces and some new faces. So just to recap, I'll kind of talk through a lot of the topics today and call on folks to jump up and add context wherever they've been working on some of the details. If you have questions, you can always kind of jump up at the end of a topic and ask questions live on the call, or you can post them in the chat, and I'll try to read them out and answer them at the end of every session. But we try to keep this a little more collaborative and discussion oriented. So, questions are always very, very welcome. Cool. Let me start with what we're focused on as the protocol team, just in terms of priorities. So number one priority, and this is a new one that's jumped to the top of the stack, is stabilizing the network. Many of you running hubs or building apps noticed that we had an incident last week where messages were really slow and took a long time to propagate through the network. I'll talk about in more detail what happened and how we're preventing it going forward. But the primary focus that Sanjay is working on this week and Cassie are working on this week, are rolling out a set of changes that will make the network more stable, make sure that these changes are pushed out to all hubs, and make sure that something like this is much less likely to happen in the future. So that's kind of what the team is focused on now. As we're wrapping that up, the second priority, I think, is going to be growing the user base. I think there's been pretty good progress so far. We're up around 40% month over month on a bunch of metrics, casts created by unique users, daily active users on apps like Warpcast, number of signups, and a bunch of other things. So that seems to be going pretty well from a post-launch perspective. I do expect that it will slow down a little bit just organically as the buzz around the launch tapers off. Dan and I kind of knew that this would happen. But we have a few things in the works that are going to keep more people coming into the top of the funnel, and Dan's going to talk about some of the things there. So a bunch of tactical feature work and improvements, but also some other things that we've got cooking. And the third focus is on improving the DevX. I think there's two main areas. One is fixing something that we've got out there, which is the replicator, which I think a lot of folks have found that the new replicator has improved a bunch of things, but a few folks are still struggling to sync it. So we're going to track down the last of those bugs. And then the other one that I'll talk about today is Farcaster Connect, which was previously sign in with Farcaster. All right, with all that said, let's jump into the first topic, and we'll spend a little more time on this one because this is kind of a more nuanced topic, but it's basically the incident that we ran into last week. And you can read through this doc. I'll even drop the link here if folks want to read it as we go. Here, I'll put it in the chat. But effectively what happened was we had a gossip loop. And the impact of that was for about a week, everyone running hubs noticed that their hubs started running out of memory and CPU and restarting often. There were no peers. Messages were taking 20 plus minutes to go from one app to another. And the root cause of this was there was a gossip loop. There was a sudden small spike of events, something that we should have handled very easily. That was the straw that broke the camel's back and triggered a bunch of cascading messages that then quickly swamped the network by increasing the volume of traffic by almost 1000x over the next few hours. And that brought a lot of the hubs down because they couldn't process all those messages fast enough. And I won't go through this in super great detail, but the TLDR is hubs send different kinds of messages. One kind of message is when a user shows up and they post a new cast or a new message. That's broadcast outwards. The second kind is sort of what we think of as a heartbeat message, where every 10 seconds, each hub sends out a message to everyone it knows about saying, hey, this is me, this is my address, I'm on the network, I'm a hub, which ensures that if a new hub comes online, they get hit with that message and they can find and discover all the other peers. So it's a peer discovery type message. There's also a contact info message that's less relevant for this conversation. But what happened was a user using the Warpcast APIs just deleted about 16,000 of their follows. They just kind of cleared out all the follows they generated in a very short period of time. And Warpcast, which runs its own hub, we'll call this Hub A, got all these messages and then just sent them out to the network, kind of blasted them out to everybody. There was a hub out there, like one or more hubs that were running on CPUs that when they got hit with these 16,000 messages, got stuck processing all of these messages quickly. And what happened was they started processing messages much slower than they were coming in. So we quickly had a backlog where, I got a message now, but hubs don't process it for multiple minutes. And the tricky part is hubs tend to filter out messages that they've seen in the last 2 minutes. So let's say I send you a message, you send it back to me, and I'm like, no, 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 I've seen it. I keep a list of all the messages I saw in the last 2 minutes. But what happened was a loop got created because a lot these slower hubs took more than 2 minutes to process a message, and then they would send it back, and the other hub would think that it was new and broadcast it out to its peers again. And so a lot of these messages that were stale and just never should have been propagated just kept building up and getting repropagated. And in a very short period of time, you had messages that were 5 or 10 days old that were still bouncing around the network alongside messages that had just been sent out. And so gossip traffic jumped, close to 1000x in a very short period of time. And that caused a bunch of downstream effects like memory leaks and other things. And it really slowed down the network. The good news is the network didn't break. Like anyone who had casted or wrote any messages, the system automatically healed when everything was fixed and taken online. And Sanjay and Cassie made a whole series of fixes over the last few weeks to make this all better. Again, I won't go through them in detail, but they're listed down here if folks are interested or have any questions. Okay, let me pause there and see if folks have any questions or anything that they want to ask about this.
The fixes that got applied, are they increasing the threshold in terms of when such a message loop happens on the network, or are they preventing it altogether? Like,
So that's a good question. Actually, if Sanjay or Cassie, if y'all are here and want to take this, feel free to jump up. If not, I'll take it.
It should prevent them altogether. There are two levels of fixes. So at a basic level, what happened was like our hubs are forwarding all messages they were receiving before validating to make sure like they're like whether they already saw them, or well, we were relying on like a gossip the P2P level, like a 2-minute cache on whether they had seen them. So when we saw like so many messages over like a longer period of time, it overwhelms the 2-minute cache. So now we also look at the DB and see whether like we've already processed the message. And if we have, we don't forward the message. So the loop should not happen again.
Yeah, it's basically these things that are listed down here, Manan. So the first thing is we slowed down just the overall rate of messages. So we just said like, hey, rather than sending out contact info every 10 seconds, we're going to do it every 1 minute. We bumped up the cache. So rather than it being 2 minutes, we changed it to 5 minutes. We made sure that every message has a timestamp. And so if a hub sees a message that's older than like 5 minutes, it just will never forward it. Like previously, we were forwarding messages that were 5 days old. Here, it's like a hub will make sure that it reads the timestamp before it rebroadcasts out messages. And they also validate all messages. So both Farcaster messages, it'll check if it actually is like a net new message for the hub and say like, oh, I've already seen this before. I must have gossiped it out before. There's no reason to do it again. And also these contact info messages, which by the way, were 80% or 90% of the network traffic when the loop happened because they're so frequent, it will also check the timestamp and stop that. The other change, and Cassie, I think it's worth adding a little context on this if you have a minute. We're actually working on peer scoring, and the high level is if a hub just goes off the rails, right? Like somebody writes another hub implementation or just has like a local bug specific to that hub. Other hubs actually have a way to score it, detect that something wrong with it, and then start ignoring that hub. But Cassie, if you could provide some more context on that, I think that would be super helpful for folks.
Sure. So we already had some degree of application level peer scoring. It wasn't being applied anywhere towards actual peering metrics, but at the same time, we already were calculating it. We've adjusted the calculation slightly so that it has a cap. Otherwise, unbounded growth could potentially lead to overriding the score of other metrics in Gossip Sub that would otherwise make a bad peer somehow good. So we wanted to avoid that. Gossip Sub has the ability to incorporate that application score. So we have a change in now to take that app score that we've already been building up and integrate it into the Gossip Sub scoring, which has already been going on.
Cool. Any other questions on this before we jump to the next topic on our agenda? Okay, cool. This one should be pretty fast. This one's on the replicator. So if we want to reach out and find a bunch of folks that are running into issues on the replicator. So if anyone is having issues, few asks for you. One, please try upgrading the Hubble instance that you're using to 1.6.6, which has a bunch of fixes that should make things better. If you want to speed it up, one thing that we found dramatically reduces the sync time is if your Hubble is local to you. So if you're not making network calls, it's obviously a lot faster because each pull of the data is happening locally. And if all of this is not helping, or if you're running into crazy bugs or things are just crashing, just please ping Shane or me on Farcaster with the details, and we'd love to follow up directly with you and investigate. We just need more instances of what's happening to be able to figure out and fix the issue. Okay. And then the other thing that we're working on is Farcaster Connect. So previously, I think this was called Sign In with Farcaster. And Farcaster Connect is, I think, a little bit of a clearer name because Sign In with Farcaster actually uses Sign In with Ethereum under the hood. But the name Sign In with Farcaster just made it sound like it was a different standard, which is just confusing to folks. And so the user experience that I think applications can offer is like have a Connect with Farcaster button. And then when you click on that button, you have one of two prompts. Prompt one is, hey, we're just looking to validate your account. So you're just going to create a sign in with Ethereum message from your Farcaster wallet saying I own this account. And then the caller immediately knows, oh, okay, this is this is Sanjay or Manan, and I actually know that this person is who they say they are, but nothing else, no permissions. The second is where they get to like add the signer, which is like, hey, this account actually wants write access to your thing. So that's the write access prompt where it actually puts you through the on-chain transaction and it says, hey, you want to do this. But it's sort of like a nice OAuth prompt where you click on Farcaster Connect, you'll get the, do you want to give this app permissions to just validate your identity and check your info? Or do you want to give this app permissions to write on your behalf? And then there's two different experiences stemming from there based on which of these paths you take. So I think it'll just be a much nicer user experience. And Horsefax is working on the details. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
No, yeah, you have the note here, right? We're starting with a login endpoint on Hubs that verifies a CUA message. So if you're on the bleeding edge here, you can maybe start building from the right-hand side of the Connect sequence. So yeah, I'm hoping tomorrow or early next week to land this API endpoint, which will be on the Hubs. So you can provide that a CUA message and get back a verification, and then some JavaScript tools in the Hub web package that will let you construct Farcaster Connect messages as CUA messages and work with those. And so then moving further to the left, we'll build out the front end side of this, which is kind of the back and forth OAuth style flow for folks who are building apps on the front end.
Yeah, and our long-term, we're still kicking around ideas, but our long-term flow is to actually have support for like almost like a WAGMI style package that you can just add to your app, and it kind of just takes you through the basic flow. Obviously, the backend components you might still need to build custom, but at least the front-end UX, there'll be like a standardized like view that we use. Manan had a question in chat. Is there a target date when the UX flow will be in Warpcast? Not yet, just because we're battling a bunch of other higher priority things with stabilizing the hubs and so on. So we don't yet have a predictable date, but hopefully by the time we have the next meeting, we'll give you guys like a clear, like, hey, this is when we'll land this thing.
I have a question on this, if you don't mind, around the Farcaster Connect. So currently with the, I currently like the create signer flow works. I've seen like a couple apps use it. For Farcaster Connect, one thing that I've been thinking about on how this can be handled is, so right now the flow is if you're on a desktop, there's a QR code, you scan it, it opens up Warpcast. On the Warpcast, you have to do some sort of signing, but on the front end of the desktop, there's no current way of like notifying, hey, this QR code was scanned, like there's something waiting, right? Go and finish on your phone. So is that something that could be supported through this, or would that require some sort of proxying by the app itself?
It's a good question. So there's two actually opposing design goals here right now. One is we want to build this in a way such that so right now the way it works, the add signer flow, which is a very specific subflow of the Connect Farcaster flow, it uses custom Warpcast APIs. So this is not even a protocol level feature. It's sort of like you can add this protocol level signer, but you use custom APIs to Warpcast. And so if you wanted this to work with Flink, if you wanted this to work with other apps, each app would have to go and do its own custom thing. And so you have this like annoying, like I have to now go build 10 different things to make this work. The way that we want to do this now is to move away from custom HTTP APIs and move to more protocol URIs like Farcaster : // which means that if you scan the QR code and you have a default app set up to intercept those things, it will all just kind of redirect automatically to your preferred app, which is like really nice for composability, which means that when a website implements this, it automatically works for whatever Farcaster app happens to be holding your keys. The downside of this, and this is something that Horsefax and I have been thinking about, we don't have a great answer for this, is it makes the back and forth communication harder. Because when you have HTTP APIs, you can easily get like, oh, the user said no, the user failed this response. But in this world where you're only doing a protocol handler, you have a one-directional communication channel. And things like Wallet Connect use, WebSockets and try to set up this like temporary proxy using a server to like send data back and forth. So we don't have a great answer for that yet. We want to make it, the first thing that we want to do is we definitely want to make it composable. So we want to build it in a way that works with other apps. And that actually is like going to make the experience a little worse. And then the second priority, which we have to research, is can we actually do things to pass data back? Because to your point, I think it's actually really nice from a dev perspective that you are able to say, hey, the user said no on this, or the user is waiting on this flow, or the user got rejected, which doesn't exist right now in those flows. So TLDR, we agree we should do that. We don't have an answer for you today on how to do that yet.
Sounds good. Yeah, I work at Dynamics, so we're actually looking at adding this to our it's one of the auth login methods. We're Web3 auth platform. So yeah, following this very closely.
Cool. Well, yeah, let us know if you have any feedback, especially as Horsefax drops like more details on the implementation, and we can do that. And then Tony flagged that he has a discussion proposal where he's talking about using hubs as a relay server to go back and forth on this. That's one of the approaches we've been considering. So any feedback on that would be great. All right, great. Dan, do you want to give a little context on both the AMA stuff that you've been doing for growth and just general channel stuff? Dan, we can't hear you anymore. No, you can also just come out here and join my computer.
It's connecting to my iPhone.
We sometimes send Dan to the little room in the back.
Yeah. Cool.
Give me 1 second. Let me just fix the background because you're a blur right now. There we go.
Cool. So high level focused on channels, and I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, but just to reiterate, we are continuing to iterate in a centralized way with channels with Workcast. So for the technical, channels are permissionless as FIP2 links to the protocol, but if they're not showing up on Workcast, you're not going to get the distribution. Our bet is instead of spending all the effort to get things permissionless when the channel primitive itself isn't quite at the place we want it to be in terms of a growth engine, we can spend all that effort on trying to figure out like how to use 0 to 1 channels, bring on-chain communities, something like nouns, and go from nothing to a very active and thriving channel, figure out that playbook in a centralized way. And then once we know what that is, we can better design the decentralized primitive that ends up in the protocol via an FIP. And so I think where we want to be is hopefully sometime in Q1 next year, the sooner the better, to a place that it's permissionless. But that's predicated on we figure out the what we think is the right primitive, right? Going and decentralizing this now is just going to generate a bunch of noise, and we haven't quite figured out like what is the key unlock with channels. It's our highest conviction bet from a social primitive standpoint. And this goes to the broader point of we do not think a Twitter clone is going to result in meaningful DAO growth. So we as Workcast, but as well as the protocol, need to be thinking about how can we unlock new social primitives that are going to scratch a different itch for people and bring them into the wider ecosystem. So 2 things there. One, been doing the channel leads experiment. It's been pretty lightweight, so haven't really added many features. We added some stats features. I have a Telegram group with people. Just the fact of having leads has actually increased the participation in all of those channels on average relative to the baseline. So that's been a good sign that building a set of features around a lead, and we haven't even done that yet, maybe high ROI. And then I think that which again, as we think about it as a centralized version of a primitive, it's like, how do you assign an FID or a user to be the one that dictates the other clients of like, I'm the moderator here, or I set the rules. And then I think the other thing that's a little bit more Wizard of Oz style, for those who kind of know what that term is just like do things that don't scale, Paul Graham. I've been kind of using my network to kind of bring people in for AMAs. And so we had Vitalik last week, we have Brian Armstrong next week. And two things. One, it helps drive activity within that channel. So last week was Ethereum. Next week, Brian is in the Founders channel, which is a new channel that has had a really fast growth rate. So kind of want to figure out like how can we get more channels like Founders that can kind of go from 0 to 100 really fast. But I think the other important thing is when we do these AMAs, it showcases the best of Farcaster in a way that will re-engage people who have onboarded over the last couple of years, as well as bring in new people. And that gives an opportunity to kind of showcase everything else that's happening on Farcaster. And by doing that on a kind of regular cadence, and we're hoping to get it to a point where it's weekly or even multiple per week, just a lot of opportunities for people to kind of stick around. And then if we get people to stick around, that's where we start to get a flywheel. So people are feel free to like kind of be doing your own, especially if you're a channel lead in a channel. That's what I'm focused on. So I have a full slate of people that I think we're going to be able to bring in. And I think by starting with Vitalik and Brian, naturally they're pretty high status people. So you're going to be able to convince other people that, hey, I want to actually be associated with something of that caliber. I'll do an AMA on Farcaster as well. So it's a cheap in terms of like, doesn't require any engineering work. It's a little bit more just operational stuff. But that's kind of where I'm spending my time, with the explicit goal of trying to bring people back into the kind of protocol, whether on Workcast or Flink or any of these other clients that can support it. And I think we're going to start with text-based because I think it's really easy to be able to share that later, right? Like someone can just send that in a group message, and now you have all these like 250 replies or questions to Vitalik, and he replied to a bunch of them. But may experiment with other clients in the ecosystem, Bill Z, Zabura. I think we could do a cool space, and that would be a really nice format. Could even try something on Lonely. But the general idea here is like showcase really thoughtful community, and I think that's the great part about AMAs is if you get a lot of good questions, it kind of shows that there's like a lot of interesting intellectual latent stuff on the network. And so that's kind of basically where I am. Open to input, so people can either ask questions here or just tag me on Farcaster, which is probably my preferred way of doing it because then everyone else can see the answers. But explicitly, like I just want to be really clear, permissionless is after we figure out the primitive. And I think if we do it in the reverse order, we're just going to move way slower.
Cool. Any questions on that for Dan?
Okay, so everything's perfect and right. Thanks.
Very well, it's going twice. Okay, two more updates. These should be pretty fast. So the first one, actually a pretty exciting one, and credit to Cassie for digging into and discovering this. But there's one of the things we've been exploring is how do we bring native signups and native directcast to web? And the big challenge there has always been how do you store a seed phrase or recovery phrase safely on web? And we've always struggled with like, hey, you either have to build an extension like MetaMask, or you have to build like an app that sits on your desktop that communicates with your browser, both of which add a lot of friction. We've actually built a ton of prototypes, and actually have one pretty far along that we were working on. But Cassie pointed out that there's actually this really nice property now with passkeys in browsers where you can use the same large blob trick that we use for mobile to safely store a mnemonic in a, like not in a browser window, but for a website, using the OS's native primitives, which means that you can now have this really amazing click a button, sign up on Farcaster, and have your mnemonic stored safely for you in a browser without ever installing an extension or an application, which I think is going to have really, really nice UX for both signups and for DCs, which now are possible because your mnemonic is stored safely on the browser. We're exploring some of the early stuff here. Cassie, is there anything you want to add on this?
Nothing to add yet.
Okay, cool. We'll hopefully have more tangible updates and roadmaps for you on those things, but I think that's going to be a big unlock for just crypto UX in general, given what's possible with the passkeys today. Dylan asked, curious if there's any public documentation on the web-based large blob implementation for WebAuthn. The WebAuthn spec has the documentation. Just notoriously, Apple and browser documentation on this is pretty bad. They just aren't very clear. The best way for us to figure things out has been through trial and error and just building prototypes and just hacking it and just starting with the like, okay, everyone has a large blob API somewhere. Let's go find it in the docs and make it work. Right now, it only works on iOS. Android doesn't actually support it, and we're exploring web to figure out how well all the major browsers support it. But Cassie, I don't know if you have any tips on finding docs or being able to build a prototype quickly that would be useful for folks.
So I'm not necessarily the W3C's biggest fan in terms of accessible documentation, but in terms of my experience in dealing with it and building around it, the trick is essentially that you create the I mean, you can call it a passkey, you can call it a WebAuthn token, whatever terminology you prefer, same difference. Once you've created that through a normal registration loop, if the browser supports the large blob extension, which you can query for it, not all the passkeys and token providers actually provide this info correctly. Part of that's Apple's fault. But as long as you get the passkey back or the WebAuthn token back, you then do a subsequent authorization request where you attach the large blob write payload to it. And that will actually serialize the large blob using what is a corresponding, quote, large blob key. And then you can do another authorization loop to request that large blob. So you have to create the passkey first. But once you've done that, then you can write and read.
Yep. If someone has time and wants to build like some open source implementation of this, I think there's a lot of folks on Farcaster who've just been asking for a code sample for this, and I'm sure it would be very much appreciated. All right, last topic, channels and feeds, or specifically feeds, since Dan already touched on channels a little bit. We're iterating on different algorithms, and Chris, who's not here today, but who's been working a ton on like Warpcast feed generation algorithm, is trying out different strategies to figure out what brings the right combo of channel content versus home feed content into your feed and actually shows you how things are working. So the TLDR is we're going to be experimenting with a bunch of tweaks to the algo and rolling out changes. If you see changes you'd like, let us know. If you see changes you don't like, let us know. Some of this is like, we prototype it, but it's really trial and error to figure out what balance of different parameters generates the best feed that people find interesting. No other things to call out there, just to call out that we're just generally iterating on this and wanted to make that transparent for everyone. And I think that brings us to the end of our meeting. If anyone has any last parting questions or topics that we didn't discuss that they want to see discussed, now's the time to raise them. Going once, going twice. All right, thanks folks. Great to see you all here, and we'll see you back here in 2 weeks.